In this chapter, we talk about ecology, and ecology is one of my favorite things to discuss because you talk about the study of the ecosystem. And there's a lot of different ecosystems, but do you recall what an ecosystem entails? Like when I say, hey, it's an ecosystem, what does that mean? Living and non-living. So when you start off this chapter, we're going to talk about both living and non-living. Initially, we'll talk about the terms, and then we go into a bunch of weather. We start talking about weather and location and all of that. But how does weather and location impact biology? It's the environment, and the environment impacts the species, the living organisms within it. So it kind of starts off with we're talking about different weather patterns and currents and stuff, and you're like, oh my gosh, this is biology. So just pretty basic, but what I want to show you is that things change, and the environments change depending on where in the biosphere that ecosystem is. And what's the biosphere again? The Earth. Bio is life, and sphere is a three-dimensional circle, so biosphere is the academic term for Earth. So depending on where in the biosphere these ecosystems are located, the weather impacts the environment, which decides what species are going to survive there. And so once we go through the weather patterns, that kind of stuff that we look at, that we'll discuss briefly today, we'll look at all the different biomes. So we're going to talk about land biomes, water biomes, and so on. So that part's kind of fun. Like you're just kind of looking at different biomes. So, of course, this is the why it matters, and we have all of these different hurricanes that come in and the impact that they have on the different species or fauna, which is the life forms around the areas of those hurricanes. Are there animals or organisms wiped out as a result of that storm? Yes, but there's also organisms that have learned to adapt, okay, like, for example, humans and their structures and so on. So, anyways, weather impacts the environment, and the environment has an impact on the ecosystem, which includes the biotic factors. What's the difference between biotic and abiotic? Right. Biotic is living. Abiotic is not living. And when we say abiotic, we're not talking about something that once was living but is now dead, like your dog that's buried in your yard. We're talking about things that were never alive, like air, sun, wind, water, dirt, rocks. Those are all abiotic factors. And when you come together and you study an ecosystem, you have both biotic and abiotic components. All right? So that's what this is saying, how it all kind of comes together and why we're studying it in biology. So the biosphere can be divided into three major parts. Hydrosphere, I feel like hydro tells you what that is. Water, so anything water related. So all the water on Earth is considered the hydrosphere. Then the atmosphere, most people get that. It's like, like the air, gases, and all of that stuff. And then the lithosphere, which is the terrestrial aspect, the rocks, the crust, the ground. Okay, so the three main divisions. Now, I already mentioned this, but here it is in writing. Where you are on the biosphere, where you are longitudinally and latitudinally, determines the impact of the weather that you will experience. If you know that you prefer colder temperatures, where do you tend to find yourself? To the poles, closer to the poles if we're looking at the biosphere. And if heat is your thing, then you're closer to the equator, okay? So that's what this is really saying. Those regional aspects of the biosphere, whatever region you're in, you kind of tend to see patterns in their weathering, and we'll see that. Okay? And what's seasonality? First of all, why do we have seasons? What is it that continues to change? Yeah, we are continuing to move. The Earth, those planets continue to move. So it's mentioning that it's rotating on its axis. And what doesn't move? The sun. The sun doesn't move. So as we move, as the Earth moves and the sun stays still, we have more or less exposure to the sun, which impacts the length of the days and nights, and therefore our seasons. Okay? So it mentions that there. Seasonal variations in day length and temperature increase steadily from tropical latitudes towards the poles. So what do we tend to see in the daytime length as we go from the middle, like towards the equator, to the poles? What do the days look like? Shorter in the northern? There's times in Alaska where they only see like 2 or 3 hours of dark. It's sun all the time. Okay, so just because we have a 12-hour day, and then of course we do daylight savings, our daytimes they change, the length of our days change, but that all has to do with seasonality, and that's why we call it spring forward and fall back and so on, to change the differences in those days. Just because we have a certain time of daylight doesn't mean that every ecosystem along the line experiences that exact same one. And you can tell that there's a steady increase, so their day length increases as they get closer to the pole, the length of their day. So this kind of just shows you the exposure to the sun, which we call solar radiation, and how the Earth kind of rotates on its axis, and you can see the different seasons. Textbook, this is straight out of your text. Now, air circulation, and if you watch the weather at night, you can kind of see, and it's color-coded in your textbook as well, so I'm grateful for that. But the cool air is represented by blue, and the warm air is represented by red. And just general weather patterns, where does heat go? Up, right? So we'll kind of see the cool air kind of coming in, and the heat going up. But the crazy thing is that they have arrows. So what is that telling you? It's making this like cyclic type formation, okay? And the time frame in which they switch positions, the heat and the cold, the faster, the more extreme the environment. The slower that they switch, the more calm. But like, for example, a few weeks ago when it was really, really hot, and then that night a cold front came in, what accompanied that transition? Storms, crazy storms, okay? So that time frame of that switch impacts the weather in that environment, and of course the species that can withstand it. So we have that showing. Now, what's precipitation? Rain, right? Rainfall. And is rainfall the same no matter where you are? No. It's one of those weathering things that it depends on where you are regionally and how much rainfall you're going to experience. So you tend to see in certain regions there's more rainfall, others there's not. And we're going to talk about those when we discuss biomes. Adiabatic cooling says that the temperature will decrease, so it'll get cooler, but we're not losing any heat. It'll get cooler, but we're not losing any heat. Where does that heat go? And look at the title of this slide. It goes into the clouds where that heat is captured. And what happens when those clouds become heavy enough? It begins to rain. And so we have another cycle. Go ahead.
Is acid rain an actual thing?
Acid rain is an actual thing. Acid rain is the mixture of the rain that's falling along with all the chemicals that may be in that area. So like if you're in an industrial area, any type of pollutants that could be there. But we tend to see acid rain, like it's not acid rain like falling from the clouds. It's what it's mixing with in that local environment. Does that make sense chemically? And if you're in an industrial area, there tend to be a lot of gases in the air as it's raining. So then, of course, it could form before then. Okay, so here, and you have these little legends down here that kind of color code the rainfall. But you can see where there's not a whole lot of rainfall, and you can see where there's a bunch of rainfall. So not a lot would be my orange, and my magenta or my dark pink would be where there is a lot of rainfall. But look at the yellowish regions. Where's Texas in all of this? Okay, yeah, we're over here-ish in the greenish, okay? So we have a range, and of course when you listen to our meteorologist at night, he's like, we're too much rain for this time of the season or not enough rain. But ultimately we follow patterns. And guess what type of organisms really like patterns? Living organisms, because what can you do with a pattern? You can predict what's going to happen next, okay, which is why we like patterns. Well, when something comes and it breaks a pattern, that becomes really difficult for living organisms to handle. So they either adapt or die, expire. I love it that you still use expire. Makes me so happy. Okay, so when we talk about ocean currents, and again, this is another ecosystem, the ocean, but ocean currents are impacted by a whole lot of things. Direction of the prevailing winds. Are the winds in the water? No, this is the area around it. The water temperature, where the Earth is on its axis, like where it is in its rotation, the land masses that are within that area or inside the ocean, like all of this impacts that. It talks about, generally speaking, the major oceanic circulations. In the northern tend to be a clockwise rotation, and the southern hemispheres tend to be counterclockwise. Just general patterns that we see. Not necessarily does it apply to each individual one, but we see these general patterns. So here you have a diagram that kind of shows that. And again, what is the red representing? Warm currents. Okay, and the blue representing cool currents. And in each of these slides, which you do have access to because they're on eCampus, there are animations that you can kind of click on that will open up and it'll explain or show you that. Okay? So, and you can tell they're hyperlinked. You just click on it when you look on the notes, and there will be a little bit more detailed explanation. Now, the regional and local climates change depending on how close you are to a major body of water. Okay, so here we have whenever it's talking about these different regions, how close or far they are from water, and it impacts that environment. So in Texas, we're not exactly close to a large ocean, but we're in with proximity. So we tend to have rainfall here. But how many people in Florida experience rainfall on a regular basis? Pretty much the entire state. Like, I don't know if you've ever vacationed to Florida or if you've ever lived there, but it pretty much rains at some point every day in those coastal areas because it's really close to a large body of water, and we're going to talk about how the heat rises and all of that here shortly. So the regional or local climate is impacted by within how proximal or how distal, how far away that large body of water is. So we have different continental climates, maritime climates, monsoon cycles, rain shadows, and microclimates. And what does terrestrial mean real quick? I want to make sure you understand that before I click. Land. So we'll talk about terrestrial versus marine. And marine tells me I'm dealing with salt water. But terrestrial is land. Here is what I was just speaking about, especially like if you live in a coastal area. So during the day, the land is warmer than the sea. So the sea, the large body of water, is cooler. And so the cool air comes in and the hot air rises. Well, in the night, the sea is warmer than the land. So then that cool air shifts this way and the warm air rises. So it's changing within that day the airflow, just based on the climate alone. This has absolutely nothing to do with the life forms. We haven't talked anything living yet. Okay? And of course then, as a result, you have the tides coming in and out. All of these factors are played in, and this is still all abiotic. Still, nothing I've said is biotic. A rain shadow. Basically, what a rain shadow says is that if you are on the windward side of the mountain, where the wind is going to hit, you tend to get more water, more rain, than the leeward side. That doesn't mean that the leeward side does not. It just means that it's usually impacted more so this way because of the direction of the rain. Okay? These are general, general, not assumptions, but general, whatever word I'm looking for right there that goes there. Are there exceptions? Of course there are exceptions. There's an animation there that will explain that. So again, still abiotic. Now, here's where we get into biological aspects. We talked about the currents, weathering, just basic regional stuff, and the impact of where that region is in response or in regards to a water or a body of water. But how does environment impact living organisms? Your ability to survive. So, my ability to survive in this case, and what this text is showing, my ability to survive has two parts. The way that I act, so my behavioral responses, and my physiological responses. Physiological is the function. The function includes like mating times, metabolic processes. There's a lot of physiological aspects that are impacted as a result of the weather. We know, for example, I don't know how many of you know, but female deer usually become pregnant in August/September, but the baby doesn't start growing until the spring. Why not? There's less food in the winter. So she becomes pregnant. That's when they mate, is in the fall, and she becomes pregnant, and she may be 3 or 4 months pregnant, 5 months pregnant, and the baby's still really tiny because they have evolved for the baby to stay smaller when food sources are sparse. And then when the spring comes around, the baby starts to grow rapidly. But they had to evolve to a point where they could conceive during their mating time but keep the baby alive. Because if the baby's born in the winter, what is there a good chance it's going to happen? It's going to die. There's not much foliage or leaves for it to feed on, not much stuff on the ground for it to feed on, and it's a really good option for predators because it's weak and vulnerable. Okay, so those are the physiological aspects. They're functioning. Overall, a statement from your text, and I'm not trying to bring up any type of emotions here, but global warming is changing the ecology of many organisms. It's impacting when they mate, where they mate, the duration, what they feed, where they eat. And we're not just talking about animals or insects, but plants, bacteria. A lot of things are impacted as a result of the climate changing. And of course, we talk about all things because this is biology. Okay, so ultimately, global warming, we just said it affects the ecology of organisms, but we use models because, again, you and I thrive on patterns, and most living organisms do. We use models, and we say that if things keep happening the way that they are right now, this computer model shows that this is what impact it will have. Do we know for a fact that that's what will happen? No. We're just using a model to predict based on what we know now. Okay, so we use those methods of prediction to try to help these species cope or survive in the changing environments. Now, the rest of this chapter is going through different biomes. When you're looking at, and it's like 2 slides for each biome, so I just want to precurse and kind of tell you what we're going to be looking at. It's going to give you some general characteristics. So I'm not going to read every single slide. We'll talk about some highlights. Some of them, it's pretty straightforward. But there'll be like a slide that talks about it and then a slide that shows you a diagram of it. Like this is kind of like, an 8th grade biology presentation for the rest of this time. Okay? We'll do terrestrial ones first. What's terrestrial mean again? Land. So it lists them here. Okay? And we'll go into each one in detail. And I've already said this, but once again, where it is located, so latitude is going in this direction, longitude is going in this direction, where it is located impacts the weather, the environment, the abiotic factors, which in turn impact which type of biotic factors can inhabit that ecosystem. Okay, so you're just going to kind of see that pattern. That's where this chapter is focused on. How does the environment impact what can inhabit it? All right. So, tropical forest in general, like when you hear tropical, we usually find them at low latitudes. Most of them have a whole lot of species, but people are like, oh, like there's a whole lot of animals. There's not like big animals. What are the types of species that we find there? Insects. And look at here. It says the nutrient-poor soils. Well, if it has all these species, why are the soils so poor? There's a lot of trees. fact. Tell me why a lot of rain is an issue. It's washing, it's leaching the minerals and such from the soil. It runs off. So if you're like going to run away somewhere and you go to a tropical forest and you're like, I'll just grow my own garden, it's not a good plan. Okay, let's try somewhere else. But just so you know if that's ever been your thought process. Okay, so beautiful, like it looks really pretty, but may not be the ideal habitat. Savannas, savannicas, which is not a thing, occur in tropical and we call them tropical and subtropical grasslands. So basically a savanna is a whole bunch of grass. It mentions that there's some trees, these scattered trees, but there's really long dry seasons, and that becomes an issue when you're trying to grow really large trees. Because what do they not have access to? Water. There's fires. Savannas burn really quickly because they're so dry. The rainfall is limited. Okay? But then we have organisms that graze a lot. We have a whole bunch of herbivores. So if a baby tree does try to show up, what does that herbivore do? Okay, that's like a fruit snack. Okay, it eats it up. It also mentions thorn forests. And this is like what in Texas we would call like brush forest, like just a whole bunch of thorns. These are really great protective areas, but they tend to occur on the borders of the savanna, kind of like a barbed wire fence around the edges of them. So the African savanna, we have a whole bunch of herbivores. We do have tertiary consumers there, but they travel in small prides, and there's not tons of them, because the resources are limited. So you can see that there are some big trees there, but mostly grassland. And those trees that are there have been established for a long time, or they wouldn't be that big. You don't see a lot of smaller trees. Deserts. Most people, when you say desert, they automatically think super, super, super hot. It's sand dunes for days. They're going to talk about mirages. But the reality is that that's just the example of one desert, the Sahara Desert. Not all deserts are like that. But what we do see in deserts are because there's not a whole lot of vegetation, so it's sparse vegetation. And if you were with me in 1406, we talked about C4 plants and CAM plants. We see a lot of CAM plants that they have to reverse the way that they carry out photosynthesis, cellular respiration, so that they don't photorespirate. Very sparse vegetation, so a lot of sand. And there's not a lot of organisms that live out there. So during the day when the sun's exposed, there's not much to protect. It's super hot. But when the sun goes down, it becomes super cold. Okay? So we have really extremes of temperatures. And it mentions that. The temperature varies widely, even daily. Okay? So you might be sweating like 110 during the day, and it might be close to 30 at night. Like, that's a huge fluctuation. Can you tell me what accompanies these huge fluctuations? Storms, yes. Storms, okay? And it mentions when there is rainfall, it's heavy but brief. So as that air is changing positions, we have these crazy wild storms. Okay, so just an example. So this is not like what people think when they think desert. They think like just all sand dunes for days. This is considered a desert as well. Chaparral is a coastal biome, so we find it on the outsides. You can see that there's dense woody shrubs, so there is some luck in access to water, of course, because it's coastal, and trees, but trees coming along after fires. In biology, we also talked about how some plants, and we'll talk about this semester as well when we get to our plant chapter, some plants, like, for example, pine trees, have pine cones, and those pine cones are their seeds. But you can't just plant a pine cone and expect a baby pine tree to show up. In order for a pine tree to germinate, the cone has to catch fire. So they've evolved to where these ecosystems can replace themselves when under fire. So because forest fires are common in this area, because of the temperature fluctuations, there's a lot of lightning. We see a lot of fires. Because there's a lot of fires, we have to have a replacement mechanism. And when those pine cones catch fire, they heat up, they split, and then the baby seed is exposed, begins to germinate, and a tree regrows there. So this is chaparral. Okay. You don't see a bunch of huge trees, but you see a lot of the similar sized trees, and you can kind of see as it borders along the coastlines. So mountainous. Temperate grasslands. Temperate tells us that we have more seasons like what you and I are kind of used to. Okay, winters are cold, summers are warm, and we have moderate rainfall. That's kind of what you and I are used to. The tree seedlings are eliminated by drought because although there are big trees, the larger trees are stealing the resources, and those little ones just kind of miss out. Okay, we have large grazing animals, but we also have periodic fires. There's fires right now that are burning out of control, and that's because of the drought. Soils are rich and deep because we don't have a lot leaching from them. Moderate rainfall. We have animals that are grazing who are pooping, and that poop helps put nitrogen in our soil, so we have nice, supple soils, but we don't grow much there. Short grass prairie, nice looking buffalo there. And here we have a tall grass prairie. What's the difference between short and tall grass? The height of the grass, yeah, that's it. That's it. Temperate deciduous. Whenever you hear deciduous, all that truly means is that it cycles through. So it has a growth cycle and a dormant cycle. And that always goes along with the seasons, the changes in weather. So this is another thing. Not necessarily are we in a forest, but the deciduous aspect applies to most of what we're used to. We have plants that flower and grow in the spring and the summer months, and then during the fall, what happens? They go dormant. We see the daytime decrease, so the plant begins to stop photosynthesizing as much. They turn their oranges and reds. Leaves fall off, and they go dormant for a while. Those leaves that fall off will eventually break down, decompose, and enrich that soil. So it's a good thing. It's a good thing. Okay? So you can see that, and of course, seasons. The taiga, or the boreal forest, we have a whole bunch of cold. The plants that we find here tend to be evergreens, which means that they're not deciduous. So deciduous means that I grow and then I go dormant, so I lose my leaves. Evergreens means that they stay evergreen, like they don't lose their leaves. Okay, they're not going to cycle through. So winters are long and cold. We have to have plants or vegetation that can withstand that. It mentions here that we have large herbivores. It doesn't say very much about predators. Are there still tertiary and quaternary consumers there? The answer is yes, but they're few and far between because the environment is so... No, what's it when it's harsh? Harsh! I was like, what's that word whenever it's like not easy to live in? When the environment's so harsh, okay? These moose and elk, they have body fat and body reserves that allow them to maintain a homeostatic temperature in like crazy blizzards where you and I would be like, ooh, okay? Or that the wolves and coyotes would be as well. Now, the ones that are, the tertiary and quaternary predators that are successful obviously have areas where they can stay protected from those weathered elements, okay? So it goes on and talks about, okay, conifers are usually our cone-bearing plants. So when it says other coniferous forests, and that's what it's referencing there. So our cone-bearing plants. Okay, very like what you see in like pictures, very peaceful type setting. No tigers or lions there. All right, the tundra. The tundra is one I think that a lot of people get confused. But the tundra, if you can just imagine the coldest, at the poles. If those of you who've been to Colorado or you go skiing and stuff, as you get to the tops of the mountains, what do you notice about the vegetation? How big are the trees up there? Why are there none trees? It's just not a habitable environment. In a tundra, the plants are really, really small because it's really cold and it doesn't rain much. And when it does rain, the rain freezes. And so the plant cells, if they have water in their vacuoles, will rupture and it'll kill that plant. So it's kind of like a cycle. The plants that are successful there can withstand those harsh environments, and there's not many. So that's why you don't see huge, big trees as we get closer to the poles. Okay? You don't see that. So it mentions that. Of course, the poles, I said, but at the very high mountaintops, like that's why I said people who ski, like you have to be at the super big mountains, but there's not a lot of vegetation up there. It's just a bunch of shrubs, and it kind of looks like tumbleweed, but it's not tumbleweed. Does anybody know what permafrost is? Let me cover that real quick. Permafrost is like where it's snow that's kind of started to melt, but it's frozen into the ground. So you have dirt that has water in it that has become frozen. And we call it permafrost because it's pretty much, but it can start to melt. Okay, so the ground is what we call permafrost. So it's like melted snow, but then it like freezes within that ground. Okay, plants don't normally grow well in ice. Okay, so your tundras. And look even on the distribution towards the poles. Okay, now freshwater biomes. Freshwater biomes tells you that it is freshwater, there's no salt water. Okay, so just making sure that you pick up on that. So we have streams and rivers, and then it says lakes, and then it mentions seas. When we get to seas, that becomes a marine biome, but it's divided. You'll see. I just want you to understand there's a difference between freshwater and marine biomes. Okay? Lakes are bodies of standing water. So wetlands are what you and I call marshes. A wetland is an area where the water falls or water has accumulated, but it has no escape. And so it continues to accumulate, but it's not fresh water. So it's like a swamp or a bog. And what life forms start on top, when they die, where do they go? They just sink to the bottom. But because it's not fresh water running in, like they decompose, so it becomes kind of nasty, but it's actually a really good environment for certain things, like bacteria, okay? Just you and I wouldn't really like that. It becomes a really good environment for snakes and creatures that don't need that constant cycling and can kind of leave. So yeah, high diversity, microorganisms, which are bacteria, algae, plants, invertebrates, which would be organisms that didn't have a vertebral column, and small vertebrates. You may find alligators and such there as well. Streams and rivers are different because they have a fresh supply of water. So where wetlands are kind of stagnant, these streams and rivers have fresh water coming in. So there's more oxygen in it. There's less detritus. You'll hear the term detrital. Yeah. So that means that you feed on dead or decaying things. You're a detrivore. In wetlands, at the bottom, we just have this major sink where everything just dies and it goes to the bottom. In streams and rivers, we have that fresh water flow, which is great, but it's really difficult for organisms to plant and stay when the water's rushing in a current. So they kind of sit towards the edge. They'll feed on things that are dead or decaying. Dead fish, dead plants, whatever has, so when it says the food webs are largely detrital, it's breaking down. You feed on dead or decaying organisms. Okay? Also on streams and rivers, the flow of that water shapes the environment around it. Okay? Which is that erosion, but that's all abiotic. So streams, rivers, good pictures. Standing water biomes, so our lakes. The purpose of a lake, or a lake is obviously a large one. A pond does a similar thing for, we see a lot of ponds on properties here. It serves as a sink for all the water, so that we decrease the amount of flooding. Because flooding, if you are in a farming area, is a threat. Why is flooding a threat for farmers? It will take the nutrients out of the soil, just like Corbin said earlier. It will, it just washes everything away, the minerals away. Also, if your crops are saturated, then they don't grow. They can't breathe. Okay? So these ponds in this area, and then large lakes, of course, they serve to help accumulate all the water. It's fed by the rainfall, streams, any type of water that may have been in higher areas kind of just drains into that body of water. Okay? When we look at lakes, we can look at different zones of lakes, and we name the zone based on the amount of light that can get through and how deep it is. We know that superficially, light can get through, but as you get deeper in the lake, what happens? Light can no longer get there. Can you tell me about the difference in temperature from the top of the body of water to the bottom? The top is warmer. And why is the top warmer? The sun, right. And we're going to see the same kind of pattern when we get to marine ecosystems. So that makes sense. But you hear the term a photic zone and an aphotic zone. What do you think that means? Light and no light. Yeah, just keep it simple. Okay? So, and then I'll show you where we're talking about littoral and limnant. So, if light can access it, it's part of our photic zone. Aphotic zone. Okay, we have warm, the heat air. This is not air in a lake, it's water. But the warm water will rise because of the warm air associated with it. So this tends to be warmer. In your littoral zones, look what you can kind of see occurring here. Why? Why can you see that growth? It has access to the sun. So we can put some photosynthetic organisms in there. We can start to see them growing around the edges of these lakes, these bodies of water. Okay? Overall, this is just the open area, and this is much deeper. Is there still life in these areas? Yes. We tend to see that organisms that are photosynthetic will kind of stay in this area, like algae. Okay? Seaweeds, they'll kind of stay in the areas where light can access it, but things that are non-photosynthetic don't have to be. Okay? Different types of bacteria and so on. As we move on, you'll see some examples of what I'm talking about. As far as when a season changes, does the ecosystem inside a lake change? Because a lake itself is its own ecosystem. Body of water is. Do the seasons change within that body of water? Yes, they have to. Okay? We have what we call spring overturn and autumn overturn. You can see, and I like how they demonstrate the current, the air current coming in. So what you can ultimately see is where the warm water, and epi tells you that that's on the top. Hypo tells you it's underneath, and that's just coming from your word roots. They'll cycle through. So we have our ice, but here's the warm water. It's stuck underneath the ice, and what's the temperature of this water here? Cold. Just because the top of the water is cold doesn't mean that there's not warmer water underneath it. Now, I'm not talking about like hot tub water. It's just warmer, okay? And even in areas where it stays super, super, super cold the whole time, we have fish and aquatic organisms that can withstand those freezing temperatures, and they just don't move for weeks. They just stay in the same position. But their metabolic rate slows down so much that they don't die, but they can survive those cold temperatures. So we have organisms that have been adapted to that. But those are different ecosystems. And in the spring, you can see that everything kind of switches around, and all it's doing is changing the temperature along with the season. Okay? So you have seasons within a water ecosystem, an aquatic ecosystem, as well as within a terrestrial ecosystem. Oligotrophic lakes. Oligo tells you many. The bottom line is that because there's many things occurring here, we have low primary productivity. What does that tell you? Low primary productivity. I don't want the clear water part. What does low primary productivity mean? There's not many primary producers, which is what? Plants. Yes. There's not many plants. This water appears to you and I as clear because there's not a lot of stuff making it look darker. Okay, like when you look at clear water and you're like, man, I can see all the way down. Very few times will you see large plants or seaweed underneath it and can see all the way down. The reason you can see all the way down is because there's low primary productivity. Okay, there's not a lot of plants in that area. There's probably not a lot of plants in that area because the soil may be really rocky and it's just not a good growth area. But that is just in that area of that body of water. If you move further to another body of water or to a different aspect of that same body of water, depending on how large it is, you may find that it becomes eutrophic. Eutrophic means that there's a whole lot of primary productivity occurring here. And we see this happening in our lakes here. I know that on the way home, when there's a lake that I pass, I call it a lake. It's definitely a really large pond. But we call it a eutrophic lake. Eutrophication has occurred. What that means is that there's not a lot of water movement, so it's not like a lot of fresh water's coming in, but there's a lot of organic activity. There's a lot of primary productivity, so there's a lot of plants. And then with those plants comes animals, and those animals release their waste, and then we have protists like algae that'll benefit from that. And then this is what we start to see, eutrophication, where it has like this overgrowth of nutrients. If you've passed a lake or a body of water and it has like this green layer on it, that's an indication that there's a whole lot of primary productivity. We call that eutrophication, when it has that green layer on top of it. The good thing is that there's a lot going on there. The bad thing is that there's not a lot of oxygen. Because there's not a lot of oxygen, over time we start to see that the animal population decreases. Because what do animals need? Oxygen. So what we say is that it gets overtaken by the primary productivity. Okay? Whenever there is a solid, like it's solid all the way across, and light can no longer penetrate it, it becomes lethal to the living organisms underneath it. But normally our seasons change, the water turns, and we don't have that situation in our area. Okay, marine biomes. Marine tells you that there is salt water associated with it. Okay, so when we talk about marine ecosystems, we're usually talking about salt water. Freshwater is freshwater. The majority of the ecosystems that are water, or aquatic ecosystems, are marine on Earth. Okay, we're going to go through each of these, but an estuary is where we say that the sea meets freshwater. So this is the area where it kind of mixes, where saltwater and freshwater mix. Because the majority, all the oceans are saltwater, but as we get closer to land, it becomes freshwater, and that's because the salt gets filtered out. An estuary is a place where they kind of mix. Okay, so that still tends to be have a little bit of salt in it, but not near the salinity that we have in the ocean. And we'll talk about the rest of these as we go through. Okay, what we're looking at here are the zones of the ocean going down in this direction. Okay, and I'm going to show you this on a diagram. But just using common sense, we have this towards the top, the pelagic zone. Towards the top, the sun can get through. Tell me what type of life and stuff is occurring. What type of activities are occurring here? There's photosynthesis occurring. So there's probably plankton. Plankton is a great producer, but also a really good food source for quite a few smaller fish. So we have the smaller fish feeding. So we have a lot of life occurring here, a lot of movement. As we begin to get into the benthic zones, we get into this area that we call the abyss or the abyssal. What do you think is occurring here? Yeah, this is like where they're sending robots down to the bottom of the ocean to do discoveries because the pressure, it's too deep for us to get into without depressurizing and acclimating to that environment. And it's super cold. And because there's no sun down there, there's not any producers. So there's a bunch of waste. This is like, I don't know, have you ever seen Shark Tales? Where he's like, this is me, and this is whale poop, and this is you. Like, at the very bottom here is everything's waste. So what we see surviving here at the very bottom of the ocean tend to be what we call chemoautotrophs. Chemoautotrophs. That means they're using chemicals to make their own food. They're using chemicals to make their own food. Because this is where it's the bottom of the ocean. There may be some hydrothermal vents. So when the volcanoes erupt, the plate tectonics may shift. Not very much lives down here. But in that, not the same movie, different movie, Nemo, what type of fish do you find there in those benthic areas? Anglerfish. And it's even going to show you that in the textbook because that's one of the major fish in that area. So here, and this is the exact zones that were just listed there, starting with the pelagic, going all the way down to the benthic. And you can see their distribution, also using the term photic and aphotic zones. Okay? And then I love at the very bottom it says deep sea trenches. Like, this is where you don't want to be. Here's no life, and here's lower than no life. Okay? And you can kind of see, and we're going to go through in the notes, it's going to talk about the intertidal zone. So you're up here, and then the continental shelf, where I'm still getting light, and organisms are there because of protective mechanisms, like this is a protection for them. And then there's that huge drop-off. And in movies, they talk about that. If you've ever been out to the ocean, you know, you kind of walk, and then all of a sudden it's just like, it drops off, okay? And the current of the water can also manipulate that slightly. There's also an animation here that you can click on that goes through and explains a little bit, like goes through each zone with you. What we're about to do, but still. Estuaries, where the sea and the freshwater mix. Highly productive tidal biomes, okay? You have freshwater and saltwater mixing. This is really good breeding grounds, okay? Really good breeding grounds because the young are protected and there's still some primary productivity. So producers are there producing plants. Those new babies can eat on those plants and then move on to their regular families, ecosystems, what is the word I'm looking for, where they normally live. A salt marsh is a wetland that has seawater in it. A salt marsh is a wetland, so I said there's no fresh water flowing, it's just kind of sitting there and the stuff kind of dies and it drops down. It serves as a sink. It becomes a salt marsh if there's seawater in it. So it's a wetland with seawater. Okay. What we tend to see, we see overgrowth here. But here are these fancy little trees here, and I'm going to bring this up. I'm pre-teaching this because I'll teach this to you later this semester. These are mangroves. Does anyone know what's unique about these mangrove trees? Look at their root system right now. Why does it have to be out of water? Why aren't these roots in the ground like normal roots? There's no flow of sources for them. And because it's salt water, they have to be able to filter that salt out. What these do is it allows it access to the oxygen and the resources outside of that water. Because this water is stagnant. Even though it's growing in water, it's not free-flowing water. It's not fresh water. So this is an adaptation. Whenever you pull up and you're on your little boats or your little airboats, whatever it is that you're on, and you see a bunch of mangroves, that gives you an indication of the type of water you're in. You're in like a salty marsh area where there's not a lot of oxygen flowing. Okay? It's a perfect environment for snakes and gators and stuff like that don't want to be bothered. So you should swim away. But you're in a boat, so just drive away. Okay? The intertidal zone. It mentions the difference, kind of saying rocky shores versus sandy shores. Rocky shores tend to be good habitable places for certain organisms, and other organisms burrow into the sandy shores. So, and when you go to different marine ecosystems, some of them have rocky beaches, some of them have sandy beaches. So that's the intertidal zone. That's that beach area that you spend your time on. And then some of them within the same body of water, you go down 5 miles, it's sand. You go down another 5 miles and it's rocky terrain. So it just depends on the landforms around it. Okay? So the intertidal zone, that's that area that you and I would call like the beach if you were going to Florida. The Nearctic zone is where we have it's still photic, so light has access to it. We start to see kelp forests, which are a bunch of seaweed that from the air looks like a really dark spot. And then our coral reefs. Coral reefs, if you've ever gone snorkeling, like you stay within that Nearctic zone where it's still photic. You can still see it. You can still see light going through the water. You can see these coral reefs. It's really pretty. It's not super deep at this point, though. Maybe 10 to 12 feet at max. Okay? So you would scuba dive. Like a lot of people think that this is at the very bottom of the ocean. This is not. This is not at the very bottom of the ocean. This still has to have access to light, so it can't be that deep. Here are our kelp forests. Again, they have to have access to light, or they can't thrive. So they can only be so deep as that they still get access to light. Open ocean, I feel like that just says it what it is. It's the open ocean, and like in Nemo when he's like, that's that open water. It's a great place for large predators and a scary place for prey, potential prey, because there's no real protective mechanism there. It mentions there that, of course, so there's a lot of photosynthesis going on. The plankton are there. Okay, those are photosynthetic. Primary producers, we have a lot of fish that eat on that plankton, so a lot of small fish. And if you're a big fish predator and there's a bunch of small fish there, that's easy targets for you. So the open ocean, and like where you and I would swim after you get past that intertidal zone, if you're out there, or those where the big cruise ships are, that's what we would call the open ocean. What does it mean that it's highly stratified? There's a lot of layers. There's a lot of layers. The deep ocean, there's our anglerfish. No sunlight, it's cold, there's a whole bunch of pressure, like talking about pressure from the water. Like, I don't know how many of you have ever seen all that stuff, but if you go that, it will rupture your eardrums, it'll collapse your lungs if you don't depressurize as you come back up. Like, it's extremely lethal to humans, which is why we use robots to research it. Benthic province is the very bottom. All of this, it says here, the very first thing, falling detritus. Falling detritus. So that's all the dead, decaying stuff just falling towards the bottom. It's just going to sit there, and we have a whole bunch of chemoautotrophs. They don't use photo, because remember, photoautotrophs means what? They use light to make their own food. Chemoautotrophs use chemicals to make their own food. So they're breaking this down, using it to make their own food. You see that it's talking about hydrothermal vents here. Hydrothermal vents are the underwater volcanoes. And when those volcanoes erupt, it does cause land storms, but underneath the water, it's boiling. And so you have to have organisms that can withstand that. We see a lot of archaebacteria there as well. All right. Questions here?